Hello, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we have the case of Kayla Berg. It's a very intriguing case, one that actually remains unsolved to this day and is surrounded by tons and tons of theories. It's not that long, but we do have about 30 minutes ahead of us, in which we'll also discuss many theories about what could have happened. So get comfortable and grab something to eat, or something to drink, and pay close attention to the names because it might get a little confusing after a while. This is Kayla Berg, born on August 29th, 1993, in Langlade, Wisconsin. Her mother is Hope Springer, and her father is James Spangbauer. Kayla also lived with her brother, Jimmy. This family lived together for a while until Kayla's parents decided to separate. Despite the separation, both parents wanted their children to have as good, normal, and happy a life as possible. They didn't want their kids to see them fight. They wanted to get along. And they also gave them the freedom to play outside, took them camping. They really wanted their kids to have a good and active childhood. From the time she was very young until the day everything happened, Kayla lived in a place called Antigo, a small town. Kayla's parents had an agreement that allowed their kids to go from one house to the other without any problem. In other words, they could go to their dad's house or their mom's house. Any day of the week, at any time, whenever they wanted. All they had to do was let him know. During high school, Kayla really stood out in gymnastics, especially in artistic and rhythmic gymnastics, and particularly in tumbling, which is a discipline that's part of trampoline gymnastics. Hope, Kayla's mother, said that Kayla wanted to be a choreographer when she grew up after finishing high school. It seems that she really loved everything about that world. Her mother also described her as a girl with a big heart, someone who would help anyone in need. This behavior might have come from her father's illness. It turns out that after the separation, Kayla's father started having some health problems and had to move to a house in Antigo as well, but with his parents. In other words, with Kayla's grandparents. As for her life in 2009, when she was already a 15-year-old teenager, she started to distance herself from her family, her grades began to drop, she no longer had the same motivation to go to school as before, and she started hanging out with her friends more and more on weekends. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but apparently all her sense of responsibility was slipping away, something that can happen during adolescence, but in this case, it became dangerous because Kayla started lying to her parents. Let's remember that she had a good relationship with her family, with her brother, with her parents, so this seemed a little strange. She started lying, especially about what she did on the weekends. She began telling her family that she was just going to a friend's house, and that was only partially true. She would meet up with her friends, but instead of staying over at one of their houses, they would actually go out partying. And not just partying at someone's house in the same neighborhood or even in the same city, no. They would go to another city, about 40 minutes away by car. They would go to a city called Waza, which is the one you're seeing right now. So 15-year-old girls would travel 40 minutes to another city to go party at houses they didn't really know with people who were over 18. Honestly, I have to say this happens quite a lot around here. It's not really news to me, and it's not something I think is a big deal either. The only real problem was that they were lying to their parents, who had no idea where they were or who they were with. On one of these trips, she met a man named Miguel Marrero, who at that time was 19 years old, 4 years older than her. Miguel lived in Wausau, and he would go all the way to Antigua to pick her up and bring her back to that place. They became a couple quickly, and she spent several nights sleeping over in that city, far from home, at Miguel's house. At that time, Miguel lived at 1017 East Wausau Avenue. That address where he was living at the time will become important later on, and it's also the place where several of the parties took place. That same year, in 2009, when Kayla finished her school year, her mother decided they would move to Texas. Hope wasn't doing well at her old job. She wanted to look for a new one, she wanted to see if there were better jobs in Texas, if she could find a better life for herself, and she suggested to Kayla that they move there together. Meanwhile, Kayla's brother had already finished high school. He had already graduated, so he decided to move in with friends. So it was just Kayla and her mom left. So she had the option to stay in Antigua with her dad and grandparents, or go start a new life in Texas. By this point, Hope had already realized that her daughter was having some problems with partying and that she was leaving the house way too often and that she was also experimenting with some things. She told her it would be better if they moved to Texas, but that she could stay in Antigua if she wanted to. Kayla really didn't like the idea that much, but she ended up agreeing because she wanted to stay with her mom. However, none of this turned out the way they expected. First of all, Hope didn't get the job she wanted. In Texas, it wasn't as easy to find work as it seemed, and she was actually doing better in Antigua, so she wanted to go back. And on top of that, Kayla found out that the high school she had to enroll in didn't have any gymnastics program or anything else she liked. So there was nothing there for her that was different or better than Antigua. On top of all this, while they were staying in Texas, Kayla's father got worse. So that was another reason to go back home. Unfortunately, once there, Kayla started acting like she used to. Even though she had told her mother she wouldn't go out partying as much and would let her know where she was, she didn't do it. She started hanging out with her friends again. She'd gone back to her old ways. The curious thing about all this is what happened 2 days before the events. Kayla told her father she was leaving the house to go see her friend Natalia. However, she didn't tell him what they were going to do that night. And once again, Kayla went out partying with her friend Natalia to the other city. The problem was that the next day they didn't come back and Natalia's mother got worried. So she called Kayla's mother to ask what had happened to them and if both girls were at that house. Let me remind you that Kayla's mother thought Kayla was at the other house. So both of them, worried, started asking around everywhere if anyone had seen them, if any friend or acquaintance knew anything about them. However, nobody knew anything. It was also during these calls that Hope realized what her daughter was doing and where she was going. She knew she was out partying, she knew she did be things, but she didn't know she was going to another city. Because of all this, she decided to report her daughter missing to the police that very same day. However, a few hours after filing the report, Kayla called Hope to tell her that they had forgotten to let her know, but they were fine, that they had stayed at someone else's house. Obviously, this was something pretty serious for Hope, so she made her promise not to go out partying so far away again and to cut back on going out. Kayla promised her that she would stop partying and would let her know every time she went out and where she was going. However, the promise didn't last very long, and this is where the events begin. On August 11th, just a few days after making that promise, Kayla went out with Natalia to spend the day together. She told her mother about it. She let her know she was going to spend the day with Natalia. But around 5 in the afternoon, Natalia had to go to work, so the two of them parted ways. Kayla went to her father's house. There, she ran into Kevin Kilchewski, an old friend, someone the family knew, someone they had had dinner with several times at that house, and someone her brother also knew, who was also 24 years old. They made plans to meet up that same night, around 9 o'clock. Let's just say that at that time, he was considered a trustworthy person, someone even her friends knew, so since they both knew each other and were friends, they decided to meet up that night, and Kevin picked her up at her house at 9 p.m. A gymnastics teammate of Kayla's named Beth says that the last time she saw Kayla was at 9:30 that same night while she was working at a McDonald's. Apparently, Kayla and Kevin had decided to stop there, go inside, laugh for a while, and after a few minutes, they both left, with Kayla telling Beth that she would get in touch with her later. According to what Beth also told the police, they had plans to just spend the night. Hang out together for a while, smoke a little, and walk around. Finally, according to the collected testimonies, Kevin dropped Kayla off at a friend's house, Miguel's, who at that time was supposedly Kayla's ex-boyfriend, around 10 or 11 at night. Let me remind you that Miguel lived in this other city called Waza. That moment was the last time Kevin saw Kayla. As we saw before, it wasn't unusual for Kayla to spend the night in this city. It wasn't strange for her to suddenly leave for a few hours. However, James, Kayla's father, didn't know where she was or where she had gone, so he got pretty worried that night. She hadn't gotten in touch at any point, so he decided to call Kevin to see where they were. An important detail is that Kayla didn't have a cell phone, so he couldn't call her or get any messages from her. Kevin gives him his version of the story, which is that he dropped her off around 10 or 11 at night at Miguel's house. James got a little upset since Kayla had promised not to leave again, but again, since this was something that happened often, he didn't worry right away. He thought she was probably just staying there, and since she didn't have a cell phone, she couldn't just let him know, but that she'd call at some point. However, later that same night, when Kayla still hadn't gotten in touch, that's when he started to worry. It was already past midnight, he didn't know where she was, and he decided to call Kayla's mother to let her know about the situation. However, Hope didn't answer the phone, so she didn't find out until the next morning. On August 13th, 2 days after all this started, Kayla's mother was already getting really worried. The same amount of time had already passed as the last time she disappeared, and there hadn't been any communication at all. However, because of what had happened before, and since her father thought she would come back, he figured she was probably just doing some teenage thing. Maybe she got upset, so he decided not to call the police yet, but did start calling her friends. Let's just say that up to this point, no one had really started to panic yet. On August 14th, the mother got in touch with Beth, Kayla's friend, the one they'd seen at McDonald's. She told her everything she knows. That same day, Hope also reached out to Jimmy, who told her that Kayla was with a friend. This turned out to be a serious mistake, because Hope relaxed and decided not to call the police since her son had told her he knew Kayla was at a friend's house. At that moment, Hope truly believed everything was fine, that Kayla had gotten upset, left for a while, but was okay. On August 15th, Jimmy called her again and told her that he had misunderstood. That actually, Kayla wasn't at a friend's house and they didn't know where she was. Hope calls Kevin again and asks him what happened that night, and he tells her the same thing, that he dropped her off in another city at Miguel's house, and that he didn't see if she went inside, that he just left her there. He also wasn't really sure how he got there, and he couldn't quite remember what Kayla was wearing. On August 16th, they finally managed to get in touch with Miguel. He tells them that he had never seen Kayla, that it had been a week before her disappearance when he last saw her, that he didn't know where she was, and that she never came to his house that week. So it wasn't until August 17th that the family called the police and reported her as missing. However, given the circumstances and what had happened before, it was obvious that the police weren't going to take it seriously. They immediately thought she had run away. However, because the family insisted that wasn't the case, they decided to start investigating. Honestly, I find it pretty hard to explain why it took them a week to report their daughter missing. But then again, there was that thing in the middle of the week where they were told she was at a friend's house. They should have gone to check for themselves if she was there, but they didn't, and they took way too long to go look for her. A week, in my opinion, is more than enough time to clean up any traces of a crime. Honestly, there's always something left behind, but giving anyone a whole week to cover up a crime is really bad for the investigation. The first thing the police did was, of course, take statements from Kayla's friends. One of the first people to speak was Natalia, the friend she went out partying with the most. She said that even though it was true they would go to this other city, normally she wouldn't do it alone, and definitely not without staying in touch for so long. Obviously, another key person in all of this was Kevin, since he was the last person to see her. He told the police the same thing he told her mother, that he had taken her to another city, that he dropped her off at Miguel's house at the address we mentioned earlier, and that he didn't see her go inside. But the strange thing, and what he emphasized here, was that the lights were off, and it seemed like nobody was living there. The reason for that is that, in reality, that house was about to be remodeled. In other words, it was uninhabitable, and Miguel's family had moved out some time ago. So let's review the situation. Kayla asks Kevin to drop her off at this house that's being remodeled, with no lights, nobody inside, and he leaves without seeing her go in. He doesn't even know how he got to this place, supposedly because Kayla was the one who guided him. Let's remember that Kayla had moved, so it was possible she didn't know about this change. Maybe it had happened very recently, and that's why she didn't know that Miguel had moved. However, Kayla's friends cleared this up by saying that weeks before, they had already been to this place. They already knew Miguel's new house, they had all hung out together, and so she definitely knew that house was abandoned. When Miguel said he hadn't spoken to her for more than a week, Kayla's mother didn't really believe him. Her daughter was afraid of the dark, and she was also afraid of being alone. She had nightmares about being kidnapped, she didn't want to be alone, and even less so in a place like an abandoned house in the dark. It made absolutely no sense that she would want to go to this place on her own, not at all. Someone must have convinced her. Besides, Kayla had gone to visit her friend at McDonald's and told her that they would talk that same night. She told Natalia the same thing. So, what happened? Why would she say that if she didn't plan to stay at home so they could talk? None of this really makes any sense. After a few days of investigation and testimonies, the police started to think that she really hadn't run away and that someone definitely took her to this place and made her disappear. Unfortunately, a week had gone by and there was no evidence that anything had happened in that abandoned house. Obviously, they went to this place and did everything possible to investigate whether a fight had happened there or if there were any traces of Kayla's DNA, but they found nothing. Naturally, suspicion started to fall on Kevin and Miguel. However, at Miguel's house, both houses, there were no signs of a struggle or that anything had been forced. There was no evidence of a fight or of Kayla's DNA, nothing at either location. However, suspicions persisted when cadaver dogs searched near the house and found traces of something by the nearby lake. It's not clear what exactly, since they never found any body. Nothing was found in the lake or in the surrounding area either. However, we shouldn't rule out that near Miguel's house, by a lake, there were records showing that a dog found something. Maybe there was a body there before and someone moved it. In October 2009, Kevin was charged with reckless endangerment, which means putting someone's life at risk. But 2 years later, after several legal battles, the charges had to be dropped. Neither of the two people involved, that is Miguel and Kevin, had any evidence against them. They had only been persons of interest, but there was nothing to prove that they had anything to do with the disappearance. The only thing that was actually done was to investigate both of their cars with luminol, which is a substance that lights up in the presence of blood. In these two cars, there were indications that there was something like blood, or maybe there was blood, but there isn't much information about this. The tests came back positive, but apparently there wasn't anything significant enough to build a case, meaning that the luminol showed there was blood, but apparently it wasn't much, and they couldn't confirm whether it was Kayla's or not. The blood had been cleaned up. It wasn't just sitting there fresh to be collected, so they couldn't prove there was any connection. Regarding the cars specifically, in 2009, a test was done with cadaver dogs, those that search for decomposition scents, and one of the dogs went straight to Kevin's car. However, again, there's no DNA. Dogs aren't DNA testing machines. So even if there was something dead in the car or not, there was no way to know if it was a person, an animal, or some other decomposed thing. On the other hand, they also investigated Kevin's phone and Miguel's phone. Kevin's phone stopped receiving signal at 9 p.m. on the day of the disappearance, which seemed odd, but according to the records, his phone often ran out of battery or lost signal around that time of day, which basically means that either he turned it off or his phone died. Since this wasn't unusual, there was no way to prove he was trying to hide something. But on the other hand, Miguel had two phones, one he used regularly and another that was already old. You might wonder why he would use the old one. I don't know, and right now there isn't an explanation about that on the internet. But that old phone was turned on that night, 3 hours after Kevin dropped Kayla off at that old house. The signal from this phone indicated that he was 60 kilometers from Wausau that same night, and that between 1 and 2 a.m., he received 2 calls that he didn't answer. Obviously, they searched the area with planes and dogs, but even so, it wasn't a specific location. At that time, GPS wasn't like we know it today. Instead, the signal was recorded from the towers, so it gave a radius instead of an exact point, which meant they couldn't check a specific spot to see if there was anything there. So they searched every way possible, by land, by air, but they didn't find anything. On top of that, along with the cadaver dogs, they found 2 more things. There were 2 alerts from these dogs, one on land belonging to Kevin's parents, and another at a potato farm where Kevin worked. But again, there was nothing at those places. Unfortunately, that's where the information ends. This was all that could be discovered. They never found anything belonging to Kayla, no DNA, nothing. She completely vanished from the face of the earth. With all that said, let's move on to the theories. The first theory we have is that Kayla was kidnapped by an unknown person. This is based on the lack of evidence. In other words, there isn't a clear suspect to point to. There are two persons of interest, but neither of them has any evidence linking them to having done something to Kayla. There were no signs of a struggle anywhere. Nothing that really indicated someone she knew had kidnapped her. There was nothing in the cars except for small things that really didn't indicate there had been any kind of altercation anywhere, which makes it more believable that someone was waiting for her there, in a place that was dark, somewhere you couldn't see well, and that she was kidnapped. Also, since they were looking for things related to Kevin and the ex-boyfriend, they weren't searching in other places where she could have been buried. The second theory is that Kevin had something to do with the disappearance. There's one thing in particular that I find very curious about what he said. He was the only person who knew about this house where parties used to be held, but he didn't know that it was being remodeled at that time. If he hadn't taken her to this house since he got back from Texas, then he had no reason to know that it was inaccessible. Which makes it a perfect and imperfect excuse, since he spent the whole afternoon with her and, in the end, said he had dropped her off at her boyfriend's house. He was the only person who didn't know that they were remodeling it. So things could have worked out for him if it weren't for that. In fact, it did work out because there's no evidence, but it's really strange. It really doesn't make sense that Kayla would have asked him to drop her off there. Besides, her boyfriend's house, where he was living at the time, was nearby, so she could have gone there. It doesn't make sense that he would have left her somewhere she didn't want to be. Plus, there were 3 hits with cadaver dogs, one in the car, one on a family property, and another on a property where he worked, so I find that extremely suspicious. Not to mention that the luminol did react inside his car. Even though they couldn't prove anything happened, there was some blood somewhere. The third theory is that Miguel was responsible for the disappearance, or that he had something to do with it. For this theory, we mainly have to consider that he refused to cooperate, which the family found a bit strange. Plus, the first thing he did was contact a lawyer, which made him seem even more suspicious. On top of all that, there were also those 2 calls made from the phone, a phone he didn't even use anymore, at night in a place far from the city. However, there's nothing else that connects him to Kayla's disappearance. On top of everything, they weren't even really dating anymore. They were exes, they'd broken up, and he didn't really have a reason to do anything to her, as far as we know. There was no struggle, no DNA in his house, no DNA in his car, and there are no signs that anything strange happened inside it either. Therefore, this theory ranks below Kevin's. And finally, we have the theory that maybe she left on her own. That is, she simply decided to run away from home. The situation at home wasn't bad enough for her to run away. She just wanted to go out and party. It wasn't that serious. And besides, she didn't show any signs of wanting to leave. She told her friends she was going to call them, everything seemed normal, they laughed for a while, she didn't take anything with her, and on top of that, things at home weren't bad enough for her to just leave on her own without telling anyone. So many years have passed, and I really doubt she just left. How did she survive? How did no one see her? How is it that to this day no one knows where she is? Honestly, it's a little strange that she just disappeared out of nowhere, so I really doubt this theory. But anyway, that's all we have for today. Let me know what you think about this case down below. I'm reading your comments. Tell me which theory you think is the most accurate, or the closest to reality. But anyway, this is where the video ends. My Patreons are listed here on the side. Thank you all for supporting me through this platform. If you want to know more, the link to Patreon is down below. And finally, here's a new video for you. Here's a recommended video. You can subscribe by clicking on my face, and I'll see you in another video. Goodbye.